you've been in management leadership and advisory for quite some time, and you've seen trends come and go. You've seen ups and downs. You've seen growth stories and recessions and stuff. Uh, it's very curious to learn from you. What are you tracking nowadays on an ongoing basis? You know, how do you make sense of the world and so many forces in the world?
Well, it is a pretty complex world that we live in, right? The VUCA world, if you will, and that's only increasing as we go forward. Look, I mean, I think in our firm, what we do is every quarter we do an update, a trends update, just on things that we're tracking. In part because that feeds a lot of the work that we do in strategy and particularly innovation for clients, and that might fall into for strategy work into scenario planning and things like that. But for innovation, particularly with younger companies looking for, new opportunities around the bend, and what's the smash up of different things that are happening and how that might sort of precipitate new chances to go to market or new growth, or just ways to upset the current environment, or to stick it to the incumbent, is one of the things that we always talk about. So so we've been updating these trends now for about 5 years, and every quarter we sit down and sort of look at what are the big things that are on the minds of our clients, and from a variety of sources, just to see what's really happening. And we're actually due to do the next update in August, so we might even already be quite far behind in terms of our last update, given all the things that have happened. And it's really fascinating to see the big stuff that's happening. And before I get into the sexy stuff like AI or golems, as they're calling them now, I think like one thing that really strikes me is in the wake of COVID with inflation coming back, is that finally now there's almost an entire generation of business leaders who've never experienced an inflationary environment, which is fascinating, and working with many of these leaders to sort of derive the so what out of that is also it's a new experience, because many of the people in sort of my cohort, and perhaps yours, have been through this a couple times, and are probably not too worried about it, because these things tend to normalize. But it is a factor, and we do have to pay attention to it. For example, I was talking with the supply chain manager the other day, and he said, we've ignored inventory for the last 5 to 7 years because largely the financing for our inventory has been practically free. Now all of a sudden, we're panicking about inventory because the holding cost for this inventory is incredibly high. So just little things like that add up quite a lot are really interesting. Another thing that I find really, just this is a long-term trend, and it's not really a COVID thing, but possibly I think COVID kind of really accelerated this, and I'm fascinated by how people behave, particularly at 2 levels. One is the relationship kind of between the company and the customer or the consumer, and obviously also internally between the company and the employee. And I just find that through COVID in particular, we've had just an acceleration of what I'm calling the big inversion, where for example, consumer relationships, historically we used to talk about things like brand loyalty, where the expectation was that you would be loyal to the brand, and marketers, for example, would really focus on that whole idea, how to drive loyalty to the brand. And I feel like we've had this major inversion now, which has been coming for a decade or more, but which is now just accelerating around this idea of now firms really need to be loyal, or there's an expectation that firms need to be loyal to the consumer in particular, and in B2B it applies as well, I think, to the customer. And I find that really interesting, because if you're in one mindset, you're going to deploy your resources one way and measure certain things and focus on certain aspects of that customer conversation, which might be very different if you're sort of flipping that around and saying, really fundamentally asking that question, what does loyalty to our customer mean? What does it look like? What are the expectations? How is it different than before? How does that translate into our customer value proposition? How does that then translate into which capability we focus on? Those are really interesting things. And then when you flip it internally, same thing. We expected that the employee would largely be loyal to the firm. Now that's kind of gone by the wayside, but certainly again with COVID and now also with this inflationary environment where most people, and when I say most, I think the statistics suggest that more than 50% of at least the workforce where I'm at here in Australia and New Zealand would be likely to have at least one side gig, for example. And I think it's really interesting now. In the old days, it was as you got more advanced in your career, you would sort of start to develop what we describe as a portfolio career, and people would be working in numerous different areas like you and I, right? We both have different interests in different things. And, that might be, in my case, startups and the 3 companies and boards that I might be on, or public speaking, or whatever, just lots of different things. And then the gig economy came, and then young people in particular started to, drive Grabs or Ubers or whatever. And then people, got involved with Airbnb. I mean, there's hundreds of these things. And, but now it's pushing into the middle, where people in the middle of the workforce, mid-career, are very likely to have something else going on. And I think it's fascinating for leaders. Like, what does that really mean? I see a lot of debate, at least in this jurisdiction, around things like, should we have the 4-day work week or the 5-day work week or the 9-day fortnight? And I think it really misses the point. I think the point is that the shift is now driving work is different, and therefore the workplace needs to be different. Operating models need to evolve, and how to optimize workforce and how to reward people, all that's changed. And I don't think that, for example, our HR communities fully got their head around this, and certainly business leadership is still, for the most part, living in this transition of these vertical command and control hierarchies, which are going the way of the dodo, as they say. And so that's another one I think is interesting. It's hard not to get wrapped up as an American with the American politics. And I suppose for the last, since 2016, we've been monitoring the polarization, if you will, of at least Western society. And I think that applies more generally, just in terms of how tribal individuals are becoming. It's almost an unexpected consequence of social media, where now we're more tribal than we were before, where you almost would have expected it to be more egalitarian, or at least less tribal. But I find it's the other way around. And so, for example, if you're a chief marketing officer in North America, one of your primary demographic, if you will, firmographic variables is political affiliation. Before you get to race or gender or geography, you have to look at that first. And I just think that's completely different than it was a decade ago. It's very interesting. So when you start to mix all these things up and you say, so what? There's a lot happening. And then you get into technology. Obviously, there's a key role in technology, but I think we also have to be aware of these hype cycles, because fundamentally, I think if we had this conversation, I believe we did a year ago or even 18 months ago, we probably were talking about crypto, right? And Bitcoin, and how crypto was going to take over the world, and how that was going to evolve. And in some ways, that was not completely, because there are lots of use cases and some emerging business models that have sort of landed. But in many ways, that was technology looking for an application, where what's different really in my mind with artificial intelligence is it's the complete opposite. We have almost infinite use cases. And the real question is, which of those use cases are really going to land, and which of those use cases are going to be underpinned by, business models that are going to allow some of our most important problems to be addressed. There is some debate about the doomsday scenario around AI, which I don't really have a strong view one way or the other towards, but I think that when you start to smash up this change in customer behavior, this inflationary environment, the polarization, lots of other things that are happening, also with, kind of macroeconomics with China and Russia, Ukraine, and other things that are just sort of circling around. It's like an interesting stew, and you don't know quite how the soup is going to taste. Sorry, you know what I mean? It's kind of, you don't know how it's going to taste. And I think with AI in particular, it's fascinating because just the sheer number of internal improvement opportunities that are available to firms to apply this technology to do everything from getting sharper about, let's say, optimizing their SKU portfolio to better speaking or engaging with customers or reducing cost per click, or I could go literally on all day. I mean, there's thousands of internal applications inside the firm to help us become more efficient. And then there's thousands more in terms of how we can communicate and engage with our customers. And then there's more again in terms of how we can reduce time to market for products and services, create more nuanced solutions. And then even more again in terms of the world is just open to your imagination in terms of new emerging business models that you might create. So there's so much territory there. It's early days, and we are really probably just at the peak, or maybe even just past the peak of the hype cycle. So it feels in some ways like 1999, 2000, 2001 with .com, just like a gold rush for people trying to figure out how they're going to apply this technology and create new things. The really interesting thing, though, will it drive up at a fundamental macro level increased productivity in a way that we really haven't seen from social or even computing, although that productivity is varies significantly by jurisdiction, by industry, and so forth. There are still whole industries that haven't improved their productivity in 50 years, notably health, education, probably also construction, and infrastructure. Those industries haven't really been leading the way in terms of kind of increasing factor productivity over the last maybe 50 to 70 years. But will it be different this time? We'll see. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done on three levels, right? So at the firm level, trying to think about, how is this going to reshape your ecosystem? And to what degree are you going to be positioned to be still the leader in that ecosystem? If you think about even just AI, setting aside the wonderful possibilities that the technology brings to us, I think the time to market to me was the big aha, right? The whatever it was, 5 hours, not even until they reached the first 100 million users with ChatGPT. And to me, that's just tectonic, right? Is this go to market at speed and scale in 5 hours? How do we keep up with that? So now we have to stop being, reactive to things that are happening. We have to be much more assertive in being proactive and trying to find ways to look around the corner so that we can kind of make educated guesses about what might come. And if we're not really doing that, and most of us don't, right? So most firms are very lazy at looking at macro mega trends and how they evolve. So that's the firm level. There's a lot of work to be done there inside the firm, outside the firm, kind of rebreathing new life into scenario planning and game theory and things like that, which are things that we aren't super disciplined about as firms to really drive that. I think at the society level, there's big questions about ethics and obviously big questions about the role of AI in, as we've seen this last few weeks with the Hollywood strike. And, there are whole industries and whole parts of the economy that are really quite concerned that this is now going to displace them or play a key role in major change, which it may or may not do, and it will for some certainly, and others certainly will take longer. But I think that's really interesting too. And then the third level, I think, is just us as human beings. What does it mean? What does it mean for me and my life and how I interact with others, how I interact with work, how I interact with society? That all plays a really interesting role in terms of, are these capabilities that you're going to develop as an individual? Are they capabilities that you're going to, largely make a bet to ignore them? And that's a tricky one. And I know we're working very hard thinking about this. It's probably our number 2 category of work right now, actually right behind, sort of workforce planning and optimization is probably the leading one right now, where people are quite concerned about that. But AI is probably number 2 from a strategy and innovation point of view. And so we're putting a lot of energy into this, trying to work out, what it all means. And keep your eyes open. We have a webinar coming up in August that will address this in more detail. But it's an interesting area.
Fascinating, Matt. I think you covered a whole terrain, length and breadth of factors and forces. I'll just quickly try and see if there are some curiosities that are simmering. Let me just see if I can address them well to present to you, and then you can speak to it. It's interesting the way you mentioned that inflation is, a lot of people have actually not run businesses keeping inflation in mind. As they say, the era of easy money seems to be over. At least if you're not an AGI or an AI company, because those are still drawing funds in some sense.
True.
And then I like the way you termed this the big inversion. You were expecting as a firm, you expect something from the consumer. Now it's the reverse. The consumer is expecting a lot in terms of responsibility and governance and social commitments, or even truth. Being open about what they really do. And the same interesting, you put the employee relationship, and that they're expecting differently from the management and the leadership and the shareholders of the organization. It's interesting that you brought this whole thing to one of the first principles around that we need to track the work to see how work has changed over a period of time, and hence whether hybrid is required, or a 4-day week is required, or a 9 fortnight required. Very interesting.
On that specifically, just a moment on that. I think when you look at the smash up of these, just few of the many trends that I mentioned, when you start looking at the smash up of these, right? So that 5-hour time to market, you know what I mean? Like, how do we keep up with that? How do you create an enterprise that's agile enough to be able to, address and adjust to these changes? And I think that's the big question. So you almost have to solve for that condition in terms of not only the loyalty to the employee and the workforce, but also how do you create structures that allow the workforce to change at that sort of rate? It's a tremendously complex and interesting area to really dig into.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'll also perhaps speak to the fact that this, while ChatGPT 5-hour kind of thing is really scaled at a breakneck pace, but that might be an outlier also, could be. I'm not saying it is, which also means there would be some things incremental and some things really disruptive in terms of scaling. And some things would take time to scale up, and you require a different kind of perseverance over a period of time for it to come to that fruition. So totally agree with you. If I just take a step back, I on one side, there is this increase in tribalism, when we look at polarization as a subject, which means more deeper and higher sustained loyalty towards certain identities, ideologies. And then you have absolute reversal of it, which is, non-loyalties towards in consumer space or workspaces. Or
fleeting loyalty.
So you have a very anchored loyalty and a fleeting loyalty at the same time, the great paradox in some sense, but in different realm, as you pointed out. I'm just taking a step back, and I ask myself, if you look at economy as such, and it's when we look at it from a system standpoint, I think the mistake that I don't want to do is look at the parts and define the parts too strong and say this is how the system behaves. But still, for the sake of an argument, if I say people work to earn, to have disposable income, to create the consumer society in that sense. Now, if work is going to get hampered by AI for whatever reason, it might have its own the dynamic earnings that people have over a period of time might also get affected. I don't know in which direction, but that might in turn affect the economy size, and we don't know. And hence, this circle, which is the earning-based, consumption-based economy, and gets funded. So I don't know whether you're thinking in those terms as such or not, or is it an interesting question?
It is an interesting question, and I don't have a strong opinion whether that sort of that model, which has largely been with us now for, let's call it 125 years, okay, plus or minus, probably since Henry Ford. That's kind of been the key driver for that, because largely before that we had a craft economy, which has then given way to a consumer-driven economy, as you've just described with that cycle. And you could make a strong argument that social media, and social in particular, set aside AI, has really reinforced that and made that much more embedded, if you will, into our behavior and how we operate. And I don't know whether or not the advent of AI or these other forces that are sort of influencing us will start to unpick that, but you foreshadowed a couple of things which I think are interesting to track in terms of, in particular, the planet and the climate, and to what degree are people now starting to hold themselves, their business leaders and political leaders accountable for, playing a key role in making different decisions, which may not be entirely economically rational decisions on their face, but you can see that and you pointed out climate, truth and governance and fairness, that's playing a key role, and that plays a big role in lots of parts of the economy, particularly right now when things are a little bit tight and the mortgage payments a lot higher than it perhaps were for many millions of people, where those big trade-offs have to be made. I don't know, but back to the polarization, I think, ironically, though, people, and when I say people, I mean the average person, because this certainly isn't true of everyone, but on average, our attention spans are much shorter, and therefore what we're consuming is much less nuanced and rich, in a sense that we're not really getting into the we're not fortifying ourselves with knowledge that we need to make better decisions about these things at a macro level. So that's a big concern of mine, in a sense that that's why populism, I think, is really on the rise, which is kind of the ultimate extrapolation of consumerism, is this populism. And we'll see if the board breaks as it keeps bending. And I hope not, because when it breaks, it will be quite catastrophic. But that does lead the way into, again, at a macro level, into inviting authoritarianism into political structures. It leads the way into, potentially where, big businesses now, ironically, are cheating seemingly more than ever, but getting caught more often than ever too. And there's that paradox too, like you think about the things that went on with Boris Johnson at Downing Street. And, we could go on all day just sharing these examples. They come up day after day after day. And, it's sort of like this post-fact-based world that we live in, even sometimes where it's not true, it's still true. So I can't really answer you. I don't know, though, at a fundamental level, we have this base belief, I think, collectively, that consumer cycle that you described is, to earn, to buy, and so on, is virtuous. And I'm not convinced it's virtuous, right? We're clearly consuming the planet. So I think there's a lot of conversation to be had about big things to even just challenge that are base assumptions that we built our societies and our firms on. The biggest one to me, growth, right? Is growth, for example, a virtue? And we've built our entire society, and the main core assumption of every firm is more, 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 more. And I think it's open to be challenged. And I think it'll be a very interesting debate to have, to see whether some of those bedrock sort of baseline assumptions to your point about how the economy works, about how it grows, how it doesn't grow, how people interact. All these things are open for debate now. And I think AI in particular gives us that essential burning platform almost to start having these conversations. The climate gives us that essential burning platform. So these are big shifts now that I think can invite some of these discussions that might become, curiosity, or they could become pivotal. It's really hard to tell which way that'll go.
Yeah. I have a limited view on this, and not very well reflected though, which I believe that the idea that more intelligence on a net is good. I don't know how to even subscribe to that idea. Because there are times when, in our personal lives or even in our business settings, we know what is the right thing to do, and we've arrived at it through some reflection, and yet you cannot proceed with it because, again, as you pointed out, tribalism, confirmation bias, the fragilities of human nature and our interpersonal relationships, which gets in the way in some sense. And you could have large scale intersubjectivities that could get people into endless arguments, pointing citations and intelligent arguments on one side. I mean, that could also be one of the scenarios. I'm not saying that's the only scenario, but given where the society is right now, because I see, and this is my last point, I think the project of the Enlightenment, my interpretation is for the last few hundred years, we've been pursuing this enlightenment where the individual needs to pursue and get her or his own truth with the instrument of reason. And now you add intelligence in the whole bouquet. I don't think that's the only ingredient or recipe for making a good society. I think we require a lot of compassion, a lot of sacrifices, duty orientation, much as these ambitions and innovations are required. But that's my limited view on the subject.
I don't have a point of view to disagree with you. I think it's a complex sort of human algorithm almost, right?
Yeah.
And not all of us are solving for purely rational economic, things, which is great, which is what makes the world wonderful in terms of, if we purely had that view, we'd have no art, we'd have no culture, right? Those kinds of things would go away. But at the same time, in a world where we can rely on others to have our point of view and where we can rely on machines to do our thinking for us, will we be more enlightened? Will we take that free time and apply it to more creative pursuits, for example, or more spiritual pursuits, perhaps, whatever you want to describe? Or, as social media seems to indicate, we'll be watching more cat videos. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, even with all these wonderful tools, I mean, who would have thought 25 years ago that we would literally almost have the entire world's knowledge base in our hand every single moment of every day? And for the most part, what people do with that is entertain themselves as compared to seeking truth or wisdom. So I'm not necessarily that optimistic that we're going to find some, with AI in particular, even if we had more time available. And there have been scenarios painted where, for example, the extrapolation of AI then would free up society to be able to do significantly more, free up more time in a way that mass production did 150 years ago, will free us up again even more. Like 150 years ago, people were working 18-hour days every day, seven days a week. And now people in certain places are complaining about a 36-hour work week. And, imagine where AI takes some more of the burden of work off of us. And now we're spending 15 or 20 hours a week working, but still maintaining a livable wage. And I'm not convinced that we're mature enough as a species to be able to use that extra incremental time to really advance ourselves. I think we need the pressure, we need the difficulty, we need the challenge to be able to rise up over and over again, to innovate, to find new ways to do things. And without that, I feel like we'll be we'll be kind of drifting perhaps for quite a while. So again, it's very interesting to kind of figure out what that means. But Len, I'm just a humble consultant that works with businesses, and my firm is really designed to think through these things for firms. But if you're in marketing or in sales, and you start to think about how these things kind of come together and ask the so what? How do we sell to people, or how do we engage customers in this sort of world, or how will marketing be different, or how's the psychology of work going to change? These are all the things that we're really kind of in the trenches trying to discover to, really try to surface our own wisdom around, how do we help firms navigate these challenges? Because, we're not psychiatrists, we're not psychologists, we're not out there. We aren't in particular, although we have a view maybe, but we're not there to solve the individual's problem. And we're not big enough to solve society's problem, although we all play a role in that.
While listening to your closing comments on the last question, Matt, I'm reminded of Francis Fukuyama, the Stanford scholar, and in one of his commentary, I heard him say that when people seemingly do not have things to struggle for, they create their own struggles, in a sense, and those struggles may not be the real struggles. In a sense, what he points out is, when we lose sight, or when there are no real struggles, we actually make up all kinds of struggles. So I agree with you. We do not know, or time will tell, whether this additional time on hand, this additional intelligence on hand, will make for a better individual, better family, better neighborhood, better nation, or a better civilization. We're not aware of that. And coming back from macro to micro, Matt, is there any pivotal shifts that you started making when you are now interacting with your client, or is it the same business as usual for the last 4 years? Are there any key ingredients that have changed in the way you interact with your clients?
Unfortunately, let's pick that up. Ask the question again, because it's going to take me longer than 2 minutes to answer it. And it broke up. So